Nothing was supposed to happen that morning. October 14th, 1977, began like hundreds of mornings before it. A heavy autumn fog settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sound dulled. Edges softened. Shenandoah National Park became a world of muted color and quiet movement. The forest breathed slowly, patiently. For Thomas Brennan, that was exactly how he wanted it. At 42 years old, he believed his dangerous years were behind him. Vietnam had taken enough fear, enough sudden decisions, enough moments where survival depended on noticing the smallest detail before it was too late. When he left the Army, he chose a life that promised the opposite of that chaos. He became a park ranger. Forest green replaced camouflage. A radio replaced a rifle. His days were filled with trail inspections, wildlife sightings, and lost hikers who underestimated the mountains. The job was predictable, quiet, safe.
Or so it seemed. Thomas began his patrol just after dawn, parking his truck near the trailhead as thin light struggled through the fog. The temperature hovered in the mid-40s, cold enough to see his breath, familiar enough not to matter. He adjusted his jacket, settled his ranger hat, and lifted his day pack onto his shoulder. Inside the pack were the same items he carried every day: water, a first aid kit, his radio, and a worn notebook. The notebook mattered to him more than anyone realized. 5 years of patrols filled its pages. Erosion after heavy rain, fallen trees blocking narrow paths, black bear sightings recorded with precise locations and behavior. Small things, ordinary things. Thomas had learned long ago they were rarely meaningless. In Vietnam, small things kept you alive.
He stepped onto the trail, boots sinking softly into a thick carpet of fallen leaves. Oak, hickory, and pine surrounded him, their colors blurred by fog into bands of gray, rust, and gold. Bird calls echoed from somewhere high above, invisible in the mist. A woodpecker struck a distant tree, the sharp rhythm carrying through the forest. For a brief moment, the sound pulled him backward in time. His body reacted before his mind did, a tightening in his chest, a flicker of alertness. Then it passed. The mountains had taught him that sounds were just sounds again. Over years, the panic softened, the memories loosened their grip. The forest replaced the noise of war with something quieter, something steadier. At home, his wife believed the job was good for him. Their children thought their father worked in the most peaceful place imaginable. And most days, they were right. Thomas walked for nearly 3 miles without incident. The trail rose gently, winding deeper into the fog. His pace was unhurried, routine. Then he saw it. At first, nothing stood out. Just another stretch of trail, another scatter of leaves, another unremarkable patch of forest floor.
And then his foot stopped mid-step. Something was wrong. The leaves beside the trail were disturbed. Not scattered wildly, not torn or displaced the way animals move through undergrowth. They were pressed, flattened, arranged in a pattern that didn't belong to nature. Thomas crouched slowly, studying the ground. The compression was subtle, deliberate. Each step placed carefully, minimizing visible traces. Whoever had walked here hadn't wandered. They had moved with purpose, direction. This wasn't a hiker stepping off the trail to explore. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going. The forest floor was still damp from rain 2 nights earlier. That meant the marks were recent, very recent. The timing mattered. Someone had chosen a narrow window when visibility was low and the chance of observation was minimal. Thomas felt the familiar sensation return. Not fear, recognition. He followed the disturbance off the main trail, moving quietly out of habit. His hand drifted instinctively toward his hip, where a weapon once rested. Now, there was only his radio.
Ahead, partially hidden by dense mountain laurel and rhododendron, stood a rocky outcropping he knew well. He had passed it dozens of times over the years. It offered no view, no shelter, no reason for visitors to stop. And yet, someone had come here. As Thomas moved closer, his breathing slowed, his awareness sharpened. The part of him shaped by years of conflict woke fully. Because in places like this, when something didn't belong, it usually meant something had been hidden. And behind those rocks, carefully placed where only the trained eye would notice, something was waiting. Thomas did not touch it right away. He stood still for several seconds, letting his eyes adjust, letting his instincts do what they had always done best. The container was small, ordinary at first glance, wedged between two stones in a way that looked accidental, natural, almost inevitable. That was the problem. Nothing in the forest was ever that precise. The rocks were old granite, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Moss clung to their edges in uneven patches, undisturbed. No broken stems, no crushed lichen. Whoever placed the object here had done so with care that bordered on reverence.
Thomas crouched lower. It was a waterproof case, the kind hikers sometimes use to protect matches or maps. But this one wasn't bright orange or translucent plastic. It was dark green, matte, chosen to disappear.
A memory surfaced uninvited. Briefings, classrooms. A dim room where an officer pointed to photographs and spoke about how information moved when it wasn't supposed to exist. How objects could vanish into plain sight if you understood terrain and human attention well enough. Thomas felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. This was not lost. This was not forgotten. This was waiting. He scanned the surrounding forest again, slow and methodical. No movement. No sound beyond the distant breaths. The fog still hung low, swallowing depth and distance alike. Anyone watching from far away would see nothing but trees and mist. That knowledge didn't calm him. It sharpened him. His training whispered a familiar rule. Observe before you act. He studied the container's placement, the angle, the pressure points where stone met plastic. He noted how the leaves around it lay untouched, how the ground bore no signs of repeated access. Whoever came here knew exactly how to arrive without leaving a trail, and exactly how to leave the same way. Thomas should have turned back, should have radioed the station, should have reported the discovery and waited for instructions. But curiosity is rarely loud.
It speaks quietly, convincingly, especially to people trained to seek answers. He reached out and lifted the container free. It was heavier than he expected. That alone told him something was wrong. He turned it slowly in his hands. No markings, no name, no identification. The seal was tight, unbroken, designed to survive rain, snow, and time itself. The container did not belong to the forest. Thomas opened it. Inside was a map, not the kind sold at visitor centers, not the kind folded into glove compartments or tucked into backpacks. This map was printed on thick, waterproof paper.
The ink was sharp, professional. It showed Shenandoah National Park in remarkable detail. Trails, elevation lines, access points, and scattered across the page were markings that made no sense at first glance. Letters and numbers in precise combinations, symbols drawn with deliberate care, circles, squares, triangles, some shaded, some crossed, some divided into patterns that suggested meaning rather than decoration. Thomas stared at it longer than he meant to. He recognized the structure immediately, even if he couldn't read the language. This was a code. In Vietnam, he had seen maps like this during intelligence briefings. Tools meant to communicate quickly without words, a way to turn geography into instruction. This wasn't navigation, it was coordination. Beneath the map were 3 more items. The first was a narrow strip of paper covered in groups of 5 numbers, neatly written, uniform, meaningless on their own. The second was a small notebook filled with radio frequencies, each frequency paired with dates and times, not random, scheduled. The third made his stomach tighten.
A microdot reader. Small, unassuming, deadly in its purpose. Thomas picked it up carefully, as if the object itself carried weight beyond its size. He had seen devices like this before. He had been told what they were used for. Entire pages of information reduced to something smaller than a printed period. Hidden in letters, carried unnoticed across borders. The room where he'd learned about them had been quiet too, just like this forest. There was no doubt now. This was intelligence work, not amateur, not experimental, professional, patient, sophisticated. The ground did not shift beneath him. Its meaning did. It was terrain, a stage, a place chosen because it appeared harmless. He replaced each item exactly as he found it. The map returned to its original position. The notebook aligned just so. The number strip laid flat. The microdot reader nestled back into its corner. Then he sealed the container and slid it back between the rocks. Only after everything was restored did he stand. His heart was beating faster now. Not from fear, from clarity.
Whatever this was, it had been happening for a long time, and it would continue unless someone intervened. Thomas stepped back into the fog and returned to the trail, his movements controlled, deliberate. To any observer, he was just another ranger finishing a routine patrol. But the routine was over. As he walked, a single question repeated in his mind. How long had something like this been hiding here, and how close had it come to never being found? By the time Thomas reached the trailhead, the fog had begun to lift. Thin shafts of sunlight cut through the trees, restoring color and depth to the forest. The mountains looked exactly as they always had, calm, indifferent, unaware of the secret now burning in his thoughts. He unlocked his truck, climbed inside, and sat in silence. The radio rested beside him. For most of his career as a ranger, the radio had represented reassurance. Help was never far away, a call away from backup, from guidance, from shared responsibility. This time, it felt like a liability.
Thomas turned the volume knob slightly, listening to the familiar chatter. Weather updates, a report of a hiker who'd missed a turn, routine voices moving through a routine day. If he spoke now, everyone would hear him. Every ranger, every maintenance crew, anyone listening who wasn't supposed to be listening. The thought settled heavily in his chest. What he had found was too careful, too clean. Whoever placed that container understood security, understood exposure, understood how easily one careless transmission could unravel months or years of work. If someone was monitoring park channels, and now Thomas believed they were, calling this in would do exactly what the container was designed to avoid. It would announce itself. Thomas exhaled slowly and turned the radio off. The decision felt heavier than opening the container. That choice had been curiosity. This one was commitment. He started the engine and pulled onto Skyline Drive, the road curving gently through the ridgeline. Tourists would be arriving soon, cameras and questions in hand. The park would return to its public face.
But Thomas's world had already shifted. He drove for nearly 25 minutes to Big Meadows Ranger Station, the largest facility in the park, a place with landlines, locked doors, privacy. As he parked, he noticed nothing unusual. No unmarked cars, no unfamiliar faces, just the ordinary rhythm of a working station. Inside, he found Chief Ranger David Mitchell in his office. Mitchell had spent 3 decades in the Park Service. He had handled bear attacks, missing persons, and the occasional violent incident that shattered the illusion of wilderness tranquility. He knew Thomas well enough to read his posture before a word was spoken. "Close the door," Thomas said. Mitchell did. Thomas explained everything. He spoke carefully, precisely, from the disturbed leaves to the container, from the map to the microdot reader. He avoided speculation, stuck to facts, and watched as Mitchell's expression changed. Curiosity gave way to concern. Concern hardened into something else. When Thomas finished, the room fell quiet.
Mitchell didn't ask questions right away. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. Then he reached for the phone, not the one listed in the station directory, a different number. The conversation was brief, one-sided. Mitchell spoke in controlled phrases, revealing nothing to anyone who might be listening. When he hung up, he looked at Thomas with a seriousness that removed any remaining doubt. "Federal agents are on their way," Mitchell said. "Counterintelligence." Thomas nodded. "I thought so." Mitchell studied him for a moment longer. "Until they arrive, you tell no one, not other rangers, not your family, not anyone." Thomas understood immediately. Secrecy wasn't new to him. He had lived with it before, carried it home, let it sit unspoken at dinner tables and in quiet bedrooms. But this time, the silence had a different weight. Within hours, the station would look the same. The park would function as it always had. But beneath that calm, something had begun to move. Thomas had crossed a line without realizing it.
He was no longer just a ranger who had noticed something strange. He was now part of something larger, something hidden, something that would not end quickly or cleanly. And somewhere in the forest, a container waited, waiting to be opened again. The agents arrived without ceremony, no sirens, no announcements. 2 men in dark suits who looked out of place among ranger uniforms and hiking boots. They introduced themselves quietly, credentials flashed and hidden again just as quickly. From that moment on, Thomas's life divided cleanly into 2 parts, what people saw and what he carried alone. The FBI worked efficiently. They photographed the contents of the container, documented every angle, every fiber, every impression left by Thomas's careful handling. Then they returned it to the rocks exactly as it had been found, releasing nothing that might betray interference. The container had to remain invisible. So did Thomas. He was given instructions that were simple in theory and exhausting in practice. Continue your normal patrols. Vary your routes.
Vary your timing. Never approach the outcropping the same way twice. Watch before acting. Observe before moving. And above all, behave as if nothing had changed. A small radio was sewn into the lining of his uniform, tuned to a frequency known only to the surveillance team. It pressed lightly against his ribs as he walked, a constant reminder that he was no longer alone in the forest, even when it felt that way. Days passed, then weeks. Thomas hiked the same trails he had walked for years, greeting visitors, answering questions, writing notes in his worn notebook. To anyone watching, he was the same ranger he had always been. But inside, the tension never released. 3 times a week he checked the outcropping. Each approach followed a different path, sometimes before sunrise, sometimes late in the afternoon, always after a period of still observation, 15 minutes of watching leaves, branches, shadows, waiting for the forest to betray movement. The container never changed. The seal remained intact. The nearly invisible markers placed by the agents were undisturbed.
Whoever used the dead drop had not returned. The waiting became its own trial, a quiet one. In Vietnam, danger announced itself. You reacted or you didn't survive. Here, danger was patient, silent, invisible. At night, Thomas slept poorly. His dreams blended old memories with new fears. Jungle paths became mountain trails. Radio static merged with bird calls. He woke reaching for weapons he no longer carried. His family noticed. His wife asked if work was stressful, if budgets were being cut again, if tourists had become more difficult. Thomas offered answers that sounded reasonable, even to himself. His children felt the distance more sharply. At dinner, his mind drifted. Conversations passed through him without landing. His son asked when they would go fishing again. His daughter talked about college applications. Thomas nodded, smiled, promised later. Later became a habit. Secrecy isolates, quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It builds walls one brick at a time. The agents rotated through the forest dressed as hikers and birdwatchers.
Their presence was so subtle that even Thomas rarely noticed them, and he knew exactly where to look. Cameras were mounted high in trees overlooking the outcropping, their lenses hidden among branches, recording every shift of light and shadow. The technology impressed him. Battery systems that lasted weeks, transmission equipment that fed images to a command post miles away. A level of preparation that told Thomas this was no small operation. Whatever had been hiding in the park mattered. Each weekly briefing brought fragments of a larger picture. The map's coded locations corresponded to places far beyond Shenandoah, near military installations, research facilities, communication hubs. The notebook of radio frequencies matched known foreign intelligence channels. This was not a single courier, it was a system, and systems always returned to their routines. Thomas understood that better than anyone. Still, as the 6th week passed without activity, doubt crept in.
Had the operation been compromised before he ever found the container? Had whoever used the death drop sensed something wrong and abandoned it? Or were they simply patient, waiting for the right moment? The questions had no answers. Then, on a cold morning near the end of November, the radio pressed against his ribs crackled softly. Thomas froze. Movement on the trail, a voice whispered. Maintain distance, observe. His pulse quickened, every sense sharpened. After weeks of waiting, the forest was finally about to reveal who had been hiding inside it. Thomas moved without thinking. Training took over, quiet and precise. He stepped off the trail and slid into the undergrowth, choosing a position that gave him a clear line of sight without exposing his silhouette. Branches brushed his jacket. Damp leaves pressed against his knees. He didn't feel them. Every sense narrowed to a single purpose. The forest was still, too still. Then footsteps, soft, measured, not the careless rhythm of a tourist, not the wandering pace of someone enjoying the scenery.
These steps moved forward with intention, each one placed where it needed to be. A woman emerged from the fog. She looked ordinary. Jeans, hiking boots, a fleece jacket zipped halfway up her chest. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail. A small daypack rested easily on her shoulders. If Thomas had passed her on the trail any other day, he would not have looked twice. That was the point. She didn't pause to take photographs, didn't glance at the trees or the valley beyond. Her eyes stayed forward, scanning distance and time rather than scenery. She checked her watch. Once. Then again. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. She reached the exact spot where the disturbed leaves had first caught his attention weeks earlier. Without hesitation, she stepped off the trail. No searching, no uncertainty. She knew. Her movements through the undergrowth were efficient. She avoided branches without looking at them, slipped between shrubs without touching them. Someone who had practiced this route.
someone who had walked it many times. Thomas barely breathed.
The woman reached the outcropping and knelt. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her hand disappeared between the rocks. She retrieved the container. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Her eyes moved quickly across the map, the notebook, the strip of numbers. 30 seconds, no more. She removed the number strip and folded it once, then again, sliding it into the inner pocket of her jacket. From her pack, she withdrew a new strip of paper, identical in size, identical in ink density, and placed it inside the container. She closed the lid, returned it to the rocks, adjusted the stones exactly as they had been. Less than 3 minutes. Then she was gone. Thomas had seen firefights last longer. She stood, brushed dirt from her knees, and walked back toward the trail. No hurry, no glance over her shoulder, just quiet confidence. As she disappeared into the fog, Thomas pressed the radio transmitter hidden beneath his uniform. "Did you get her?" he whispered. A pause. Then the reply came, calm and controlled. "We got her." Thomas remained still for another 20 minutes.
His legs cramped, cold seeped through his clothes. His heart refused to slow. Somewhere beyond his line of sight, agents were making the arrest away from the outcropping, preserving the illusion that nothing unusual had occurred. When the radio spoke again, in a place chosen carefully to avoid attention. No handcuffs on a trail, no raised voices among the trees. The woman Thomas had watched disappear into the fog was taken quietly, efficiently, as if she were being removed from the world without leaving a ripple behind. By the time Thomas reached the ranger station, unmarked vehicles filled the parking lot. Men and women moved with controlled urgency, speaking in low voices, carrying folders and equipment that did not belong in a national park. The building felt smaller than it ever had before, as if the walls themselves were aware they were now holding something dangerous.
Special Agent Hayes met him at the door. For the first time since this had begun, the agent's expression showed something beyond calculation. "This is bigger than we thought," Hayes said. They walked together down a narrow hallway and into an office that had become a temporary command center. Maps covered the walls. Not park maps, regional maps, state maps, marked with symbols Thomas now recognized. Hayes closed the door. "Her name is Catherine Wells," he said. "Civilian analyst, Defense Intelligence Agency." The words landed slowly. Top secret clearance, satellite reconnaissance, strategic assessments, the kind that shaped how nations planned for war. Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "She's been doing this for years," Hayes continued. "We believe since the late 1960s. Recruited early, trained patiently, activated only when she was in position to deliver real value." The container in the forest was no longer just a container. It was a node. The map Thomas had found was laid out on the desk in front of him, enlarged, annotated. No longer mysterious, but far more disturbing.
Each coded location represented a request, each symbol a priority. Some sites corresponded to military bases, others to research facilities, communications infrastructure, transportation hubs. Thomas stared at the map. The forest had been chosen because it looked harmless, because it trained people not to see patterns, because millions of visitors passed through every year without ever noticing what didn't belong. Wells wasn't walking alone, Hayes added. She was one of several, a ring. The phrase echoed in Thomas's mind, a ring. A system of individuals compartmentalized, each knowing little beyond their role, feeding information into channels designed to survive scrutiny, designed to outlast suspicion. The documents Wells had delivered that morning had already been photographed before her arrest. They pointed to others, not names yet, just connections, indicators, threats. The damage assessment would take years. What had been passed? What had been compromised? What decisions had been influenced by intelligence that should never have crossed borders? And somewhere, someone had coordinated it all.
The handler is still out there, Hayes said quietly, and he knows something went wrong. Thomas understood immediately. A system this careful would notice silence, missed check-ins, broken routines. The arrest of one courier would trigger alarms elsewhere. Left the office, the weight of that realization followed him. He had expected relief, closure. Instead, he felt something closer to responsibility. He had opened a door that could not be closed. The disturbed leaves on a trail had led here, and beyond this room, beyond this park, forces were already moving to protect what had been uncovered or to erase it. Once the first arrest was made, the illusion of control disappeared. What followed was not a single investigation, but many unfolding at the same time, quietly, methodically, across offices and jurisdictions that rarely shared more than they had to. The map Thomas had found became the center of it all. Analysts spread it across conference tables and pinned it to walls.
Each symbol was examined, each coded location compared against military installations, research labs, defense contractors, and communication hubs across multiple states. Patterns emerged, not obvious ones, not lines you could draw with a marker and explain in a briefing slide. These were deeper patterns, built on timing, access, and opportunity. Several of the marked locations corresponded to places where classified information changed hands. Others aligned with facilities involved in satellite technology, naval communications, and nuclear research. Some sites appeared harmless on their own. Together, they formed a web designed to collect fragments. No single courier carried everything. No single source understood the full picture. Each person fed the network just enough to remain useful without becoming dangerous to their handlers. Catherine Wells had been one of the most valuable. Her position allowed her to see how American intelligence interpreted Soviet capabilities, what analysts believed, what they feared, what they underestimated. That kind of information was more valuable than raw data. It revealed how decisions would be made.
Within days of her arrest, surveillance teams shifted their focus. Dead drops were monitored. Communication channels were probed. Financial records were quietly reviewed. Careers that had appeared unremarkable for years were suddenly examined under unforgiving light. The results were sobering. Over the following months, investigators identified additional individuals connected to the same network. A Navy communications specialist, a civilian contractor working on satellite imaging, an energy analyst with access to sensitive nuclear data. Each arrest was made quietly. No headlines, no public statements, just people removed from their routines and absorbed into sealed courtrooms and classified files. But the network was not fully captured. One presence remained conspicuously absent: the handler, still missing. The individual who coordinated schedules, who issued instructions, who ensured that each part of the system remained isolated and secure. Intelligence analysts believed he had vanished within hours of Wells's arrest. No messages sent, no mistakes made, no traceable exit. Just silence.
A silence that suggested experience and caution. The operation was given a name: Operation Forest Shadow. Not because of where it began, but because of how it functioned. Moving through spaces no one questioned. Using environments designed to be ignored. Relying on patience rather than force. Thomas's role in all of this remained invisible. He continued his patrols. continued answering questions from tourists, continued writing in his notebook. The outcropping was left untouched now, its purpose finished, its significance known only to a handful of people. To everyone else, it was still just rock and moss. Weeks turned into months. The arrests slowed. The map's last symbols were accounted for. The network, once active and efficient, had been broken into fragments too small to function. Still, the absence of the handler lingered, an unanswered question, proof that even the most successful counterintelligence operation rarely ends with complete certainty. For Thomas, the forest slowly returned to what it had been, but it never looked the same again.
When the operation ended, nothing changed on the surface. The park opened each morning. Visitors arrived with maps and cameras. Children asked about bears. Hikers complained about weather and steep trails. The mountains remained indifferent to what had unfolded beneath their trees. Thomas returned to his routine. That, in many ways, was the hardest part. There were no ceremonies, no public acknowledgments, no moment where the weight of what he had done was released into words others could share. The investigation receded into classified files and locked rooms, leaving Thomas alone with knowledge he was not allowed to discuss. Secrecy did not end when the arrests stopped, it deepened. He was instructed to say nothing, not to other rangers, not to friends, not to his family. Even the questions he carried in his own mind had nowhere to go. At home, his wife noticed the change. Not immediately, not all at once, but in the way his answers grew shorter, in the way his eyes drifted during conversations, in the way silence began to fill spaces where laughter once lived.
She asked if he was all right. Thomas said yes. It was the simplest lie, and the most necessary. His children sensed it too. His daughter spoke less about school. His son stopped asking when they would go fishing again. The distance was familiar, uncomfortably similar to the months after he returned from Vietnam. He had promised himself he would never bring that war home again, and yet, in a different form, he had. At work, the forest felt altered. Every trail carried memory now. Every patch of disturbed ground held possibility. Thomas found himself watching not just the landscape, but the people moving through it. How they walked, where they paused, what they ignored. Vigilance, once reawakened, does not fade easily. Sometimes he hiked back to the outcropping alone. There was nothing left to see. No container, no markers, just stone and moss and fallen leaves. To anyone else, it was indistinguishable from thousands of similar formations scattered across the mountains. To Thomas, it was a reminder, not of danger, but of responsibility.
He thought about Catherine Wells occasionally, not with anger, not even with curiosity, more with a quiet attempt to understand. What kind of life allows someone to live two truths at once? What it cost to maintain a lie for years without breaking? He never found an answer. The FBI checked in less and less frequently as time passed. Eventually, they stopped entirely. The operation moved into training manuals and classified case studies, stripped of emotion and reduced to lessons learned. Thomas received a commendation years later. It was presented in a small room, attended by men whose names he would never remember. The document praised vigilance, attention to detail, service beyond expectation. He folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer at home. He never showed it to anyone. Life continued. The Cold War moved toward its final years. New threats emerged. Old ones faded. The world changed loudly and publicly. Thomas remained where he was, walking trails, writing notes, watching quietly.
Because he understood something most people never would. That history does not always announce itself with explosions or speeches. Sometimes it hides in ordinary places. Sometimes it waits beneath leaves and fog. And sometimes it depends entirely on whether one person chooses to look twice at something that doesn't belong. The forest taught him that, and he never forgot. Years passed. The Cold War did not end with a single moment, but with a long, uneven fading. Walls fell. Flags were lowered. Old certainties dissolved into new uncertainties. For most people, history unfolded through headlines and speeches. For Thomas Brennan, it unfolded more quietly. He remained a park ranger for another decade, walked the same trails, watched the same seasons return again and again. The fog still rolled in on autumn mornings, softening the forest, just as it had on that Thursday in October, so many years before. Visitors came and went, millions of them. None of them knew what had once been hidden beneath their feet.
Operation Forest Shadow remained classified for years. When details were finally declassified, they appeared briefly in academic journals, training manuals, and museum exhibits. A case study, an example, a footnote in the long history of Cold War counterintelligence. Most readers moved on quickly. It was not a dramatic story in the way people expected espionage to be. There were no car chases, no public trials broadcast on television, no villains confessing under bright lights. Just patience, just observation, just a series of ordinary decisions made by people who noticed what others ignored. Thomas retired in 1989, the same year the Berlin Wall fell. His obituary, years later, mentioned his service in Vietnam and his long career as a park ranger. It spoke of his love for the mountains, his dedication to his family, his quiet professionalism. It said nothing about dead drops, nothing about coded maps, nothing about the intelligence network that had unraveled because he noticed disturbed leaves on a trail.
Family knew only fragments, that he had once helped the federal government, that there were things he was never allowed to talk about, that a part of his life remained sealed even to those closest to him, and that was enough. The container he found that morning was eventually displayed behind glass at a museum in Washington, a small waterproof case, a map marked with symbols most people could not decode. Visitors passed it every day. Some glanced at it briefly before moving on to more dramatic exhibits. Others paused, reading the plaque, trying to imagine how something so ordinary could have carried such consequence.
Few truly understood, because the lesson of that forest was never meant to be loud. The Cold War was not only fought in conference rooms and capitals, it was fought in quiet places, in overlooked spaces, in moments when vigilance mattered more than force. It was fought by people like Thomas Brennan, a man who believed his dangerous days were behind him, a man who discovered that service does not end when you leave the battlefield. It simply changes form. And on that foggy morning in October, when nothing was supposed to happen, one small act of attention became a quiet victory, one that helped keep far worse outcomes from ever becoming necessary. The forest returned to silence. The leaves fell. The trails endured. And history moved on, shaped in part by a man who chose to look twice.